Today's story is yet another reminder that the woods, especially at night, are not a safe place. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please purchase a huge billboard that's located right across the street from the Like Button's house, and every month put on it a new spoiler for one of the Like Button's favorite TV shows, movies, or video games. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of December 6th, 1997, a man named Yuri Trush drew his rifle and crept silently through a remote forest in eastern Russia as he and his team of 3 other armed men and his dog followed this trail of pink snow. All of the men and the dog were on very high alert because they knew someone or something was out in these woods watching them. After walking for a while, Yuri and his crew spotted a small cabin up ahead in this clearing. This cabin, they knew, belonged to a guy named Vladimir Markov, who was a hunter who had gone missing recently, and that was actually why Yuri and this crew were out here. They were searching for Vladimir. But as Yuri and his crew got closer to this cabin, Yuri couldn't help but feel really terrified. Yuri was a 47-year-old big-time weightlifter, an ex-military guy who was also a seasoned hunter. I mean, this is a tough, strong guy. But as he walked up on Vladimir's cabin, it was super obvious that something horrible and violent had happened here. All around the scene was pieces of broken furniture. There was a ceramic sink that was shattered outside and the pieces were everywhere. There was a bunch of beehive boxes that had been badly damaged. There was the shed that clearly had been ripped to pieces. And also all over the area outside of this cabin was blood. And this pink trail of snow, this blood trail they were following, led right up to the front door of this cabin, where there was also a big streak of blood on the front door. Now, even though Yuri was scared to go any further, he knew he was in charge and he had to go and look inside that cabin to see if maybe Vladimir was there. And so Yuri walked into the bloody clearing. He made his way up to the front door of the cabin, and with his crew right behind him on the porch, he used his rifle and pushed the door inward. Now, at first, Yuri didn't see anything inside the cabin because his eyes hadn't adjusted and there were no windows, so no light was coming into the cabin. But after a second of Yuri kind of standing in the doorway with his rifle to make sure there was no threat inside the cabin, his eyes adjusted and he realized Vladimir was not in there. And in fact, the cabin looked abandoned. So Yuri stepped inside and he looked around, and immediately he noticed all the walls inside this cabin were covered in these deep gouges and scratches. And then he looked on the ground and he found more wrecked furniture and lots more blood. But in a weird way, this actually gave Yuri some hope that maybe Vladimir was alive. He might be badly hurt, but if he's not here, he must be somewhere. And so Yuri turned around and he walked out of the cabin, and right as he stepped onto the snow with his men and his dog right behind him, 3 things happened practically all at once. The first thing was Yuri's dog began whining uncontrollably and running in circles. And number 2, there were all these crows in the trees nearby that just all at once suddenly flew into the sky and disappeared. And the third thing was this unbelievably loud growling sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere really far away and also somewhere really close. It was like the forest itself was growling. 5 days earlier, on December 1st, the soon-to-be missing hunter, Vladimir Markov, decided to give up on another unsuccessful hunt, and he slung his rifle over his shoulders and he lit a cigarette under his big bushy mustache, and he and his 3 dogs turned around and began the slow walk back to their small cabin in the middle of the woods. Vladimir was really frustrated because he'd been staying in this cabin in the woods, away from his wife, away from his family, to try to hunt some game and bring some meat back, but so far he hadn't caught anything. But as Yuri and his 3 dogs kind of rounded a corner in this forest, he spotted something up ahead that was like an answer to his prayers. He saw there was a dead boar just lying out in the middle of the forest, and it was in this big pool of blood, and there was still steam coming off of the body, which meant this was a fresh kill. And so Vladimir raised his rifle in case whatever had killed this animal was nearby, but when he didn't see anything, he just went with his dogs over to the carcass, and he pulled out a hatchet and he cut off 2 big haunches of meat from this boar. Now, Vladimir knew it was totally in bad form to steal another potential hunter's kill, although he didn't know if a hunter had killed this boar or if another animal had killed this boar, but he still felt bad about what he was doing. However, Vladimir was desperate. He didn't have any meat, and here it was, so he took the opportunity. After Vladimir had wrapped up this meat and put it in his bag, he and his 3 dogs jogged the last few miles back to the cabin, and when they got there, it was basically pitch black outside. Now, Vladimir was not scared of the forest at night, but he knew there were predators out here at night, so he needed to act quickly. So he rushed over to his small shed that was right outside of his cabin, and he put the boar meat inside, shut the door, and locked it, and then he turned to go into his cabin to retire for the night, but after taking only a couple of steps towards his cabin, he realized his 3 dogs had not followed him. And so he turned around, and he saw the 3 dogs were totally on edge, looking out beyond the shed where he had just put the meat. They were kind of looking out into the dark forest. Now remember, he's all alone in the middle of the woods here. It's nighttime, there's no visibility. And so Vladimir grabbed his flashlight and he shined it kind of roughly in the direction that the dogs were looking, like they had seen something. And he's shining his light, but all he sees are just dark trees and nothingness. There was nothing there. Vladimir did his best not to panic, but he couldn't help but feel like there was a predator nearby and his dogs had picked up on it, and so he just wanted to get inside the cabin and shut and lock the door as quickly as possible. And so he began backing up towards the door of his cabin while calling his dogs towards him, and 2 of the dogs followed. But a 3rd dog just stayed where she was and continued to kind of whine and growl and look out away from the cabin in this direction that all the dogs were looking. But eventually, this dog just took off running into the forest. Vladimir, who loved his dogs, screamed and screamed for this dog to come back. But the dog didn't. And so Vladimir just stood there with his 2 dogs in front of his cabin door, listening to the bark of this 3rd dog getting farther and farther away into the woods. And then suddenly, Vladimir heard his dog start to whimper. And then it was like the forest erupted with the loudest growl he had ever heard in his life. And then there was silence. Vladimir was horrified and just instinctively grabbed the 2 other dogs and stumbled into his cabin and shut and locked the door behind him. Now, Vladimir adored his 3 dogs. Those were his closest friends in the world, and all he wanted to do was run out there and save that 3rd dog. But just based on how loud that growl was, he knew whatever was out there would kill him. And so this was a suicide mission if he went out there. And so he decided he would just stay put with the 2 dogs. And he just hoped that his 3rd dog somehow survived its encounter with whatever was out there. If you're enjoying today's story, well, I have exciting news for you. My long-awaited very first book is out right now. It's called MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, and it's shipping worldwide right now. This graphic novel was truly a labor of love, but I can tell you it came out just beautiful, and I think you're going to love it as much as we do. It has 4 feature-length, brand new stories, one of which you're listening to right now, along with 5 OG classic MrBallen stories that have all been reformatted and re-edited to fit this book. If you want to purchase a copy of this bad boy, just go to book.ballenstudios.com, or you can go wherever books or audiobooks are sold. And speaking of audiobooks, if you enjoy hearing me tell you stories, well, guess what? There is an audiobook version of this. And I can tell you, when I recorded said audiobook, I got really into it and kind of, at times, went off script, kind of dramatically so. And so it winds up being this really cool accompanying piece to the graphic novel, but it's also a really unique standalone MrBallen piece. So it's like a really cool thing to get that is not just a regurgitation of what you read in the book. It's its own thing. Again, my first book, MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. Go to book.ballenstudios.com or anywhere else books are sold to get your copy today. After sitting in his cabin for only a couple of minutes, kind of consoling his two other dogs, Vladimir heard more activity outside of his cabin. He heard what sounded like wood splintering and breaking. Now, there were no windows in Vladimir's cabin. However, he had drilled a couple of holes, very small holes, in each of the walls of the cabin so he could look out and use them as hunting blinds. And so Vladimir ran to the hole that looked out the front of his cabin towards where his shed was and where this wood breaking sound was coming from. And when he looked out through this hole, remember, it's the middle of the night, there's no lights outside, so he couldn't really see anything. But even in the darkness, when he looked kind of roughly in the direction of the shed where the boar meat was, he could clearly see this huge, shadowy creature moving around really violently, like its body was jerking in different directions. And it was obvious to Vlad that whatever this creature was, it was ripping his shed to pieces, breaking all the wood apart, probably to get in and get the boar meat. And that's when it dawned on Vladimir that whatever this creature was, it very likely was the creature that killed the boar that he stole, and now this creature was back to reclaim its meat. And so as Vladimir realized that, he just hoped that whatever this creature was, once it had its boar meat back, that it would just leave and not come after him. However, after this creature had totally decimated the shed, and so by default had clearly reached the boar meat inside, the creature didn't leave. It just sat down and stared in the direction of Vladimir and the cabin. And for several hours, Vladimir just continued to stare out this hunting blind hole at this shadow creature that was not moving. And after a while, Vladimir got tired. The creature wasn't moving. It's the middle of the night. He'd been really busy all day. And so at some point, Vladimir and his two dogs kind of dozed off. And when they woke up a couple hours later, when it was still dark outside, Vladimir looked out the hole again, and he saw the creature was actually now gone. For a second, Vladimir was relieved. He's thinking, great, this thing's gone, I'm safe now. But just to make sure, he wanted to go to the other holes he had drilled in the walls of his cabin to look out in all four directions and make sure this creature really was gone. So he stood up and he walked over to one side, he looked out that hole, and all he saw was dark forest, nothing there. He walked to the other side of the cabin to another one of these holes, he looked out it, and again, just dark forest, no creature. Then he goes to the back of his cabin and looks out that hole, and this time, again, he does see just dark forest, but then suddenly something slammed into the wall that he's looking through, and then just as suddenly as this huge collision has happened, as Vladimir is kind of still looking out the hole, this massive yellow eye suddenly lowers down and looks right back through the hole right at Vladimir. It was the shadowy creature that had broken into the shed, and it had never left. And this creature, after quickly looking at Vladimir through the hole, it backed up a little bit, exposing its entire face to Vladimir. And Vladimir, who's so scared he can't move, he's just looking out the hole the whole time, he sees this enormous face with all this fur that's covered in blood. It's got these enormous teeth and its mouth is open and it's staring right at him like it wants to jump on him and kill him. And then this creature winds up and swipes at the hole and literally rips a bunch of wood off the side of the cabin. And reflexively, Vladimir just grabs his rifle, raises it, and fires a shot through the hole at this creature. And the creature whimpers, turns around, and runs off. Vladimir would stay up the rest of the night, anxiously looking through each of the holes around his cabin, just anticipating this horrible thing to come right back and try to attack him again. But eventually the sun came up and the creature did not come back, and so Vladimir was thinking, okay, now I'm safe. I can go outside and kind of figure out what's happened here and figure out my next move. And so Vladimir grabbed his dogs, he went to his door, he opened it up, he stepped outside and looked around, he didn't see anything, As a precaution, he fired his rifle into the air to scare off any animals that could be nearby. And when clearly, the creature wasn't here, there's nothing here, he's all alone, he stepped down onto the snow and he noticed these huge prints in the snow, which had to be from this shadowy creature that had tried to attack him. But now that it was daylight, Vladimir can look at these prints up close, and he knew what kind of creature this was. This was a Siberian tiger, and this was an enormous Siberian tiger. But that was not the most terrifying part of this discovery. Instead, it was what Vladimir saw these prints doing. These prints circled around the cabin over and over and over again, which meant the night before, after Vladimir fell asleep, this tiger had come up and basically begun stalking him and his two dogs. It must have known they were in the cabin. And then at some point, maybe the tiger saw Vladimir's eye inside of that little hole he was looking through, and the tiger tried to pounce. But Vladimir's thinking to himself, something's wrong with this Siberian tiger. While Siberian tigers are certainly dangerous to people, they are not known for actively hunting people. That's not something they do. But based on these prints, and just generally based on what Vladimir saw the night before, it seemed very likely that this Siberian tiger was actively stalking Vladimir. But even though Vladimir was totally terrified by this point, the only thought really going through his mind at this point was going out and trying to find his missing third dog. He knew the chances of his dog still being alive were slim, but he had to go look. However, he knew he would need backup in case he ran into this Siberian tiger. So Vladimir put his two dogs on leashes, and then with them in hand, he began running towards his neighbor's house. It would take Vladimir and his dogs about 1 hour to run the 4 miles to his neighbor's cabin, and when he got there, he knocked, and his neighbor, whose name was Ivan, he opened the door, and Vladimir practically ran Ivan over, just trying to get inside of his cabin to safety. And then once Vladimir was inside and Ivan had shut the door and he's looking at Vladimir, and then Vladimir just kind of vomited out all the stuff that had happened over the past 12 to 24 hours. And at the end of telling Ivan the story, Vladimir asked him, "Would you please come with me to go find my dog?" And Ivan, he just stared at Vladimir and eventually just said, "No." And then, after a long, awkward silence, Ivan kind of backed up from Vladimir, like he didn't want to be near him. And then Ivan told Vladimir that Vladimir had been marked by the tiger, and now the only hope he had was getting as far as humanly possible away from this tiger, because that tiger is never going to stop, and it's going to eventually track you down and kill you. Vladimir felt totally let down, but he couldn't force Ivan to go with him, and so he said, "Okay, I understand." And then Vladimir left Ivan's cabin, he went back outside, and the instant he was back on the snow, one of his two dogs suddenly acted like they had heard something or seen something, and they took off running. Vladimir didn't have a chance to grab the dog's leash, and so he's watching as yet again one of his dogs is disappearing into the forest. Now, Vladimir did not chase after this second dog because he knew there was this Siberian tiger out there and he couldn't risk, running into it by himself. And so again, it totally pained him to watch his beloved dog vanish into danger, but he really couldn't do anything about it right then. And so instead, Vladimir spent the rest of this day going cabin to cabin all over this area, asking all his neighbors, please come with him to help him track down his dogs. But each of the people he spoke to just said no for the same reasons Ivan did. They said, "Vlad, you have been marked by the tiger. I'm not going out there with you." And so finally, as darkness began to fall, Vladimir and his one remaining dog just gave up trying to get help, and they turned around and began walking back towards their cabin. It was nearly pitch black by the time Vladimir and his dog arrived at the cabin, and when they got there, even though he could barely see anything, Vladimir knew something was terribly wrong. Vladimir's outdoor sink, which sat right outside of his cabin, was broken to pieces, like something had smashed it. And then also all of his beekeeping boxes had been broken apart, and there were obvious teeth marks all over it. Now, these two things had not happened when he had left that morning to try to go get help, which meant very likely the Siberian tiger had come back and done this damage, and very likely was still in the area. And so all Vladimir is thinking is, I have to get in my cabin as fast as possible and shut and lock that door. And And so Vladimir grabbed his last dog, and very carefully he maneuvered his way through all the wreckage. He went up to his front door, and as he's about to open it up, he hears whimpering, and it sounds like one of his dogs who's gone missing, and the whimpering is coming from inside of his cabin. And so without any hesitation, Vladimir flung the door the rest of the way open, and he looked inside, and he couldn't see anything at first, but then he noticed there was this kind of pile of broken up furniture from the day before, and the whimpering appeared to be coming from underneath it. And so Vladimir rushed over and he began moving the furniture out of the way, and sure enough, underneath it, he finds one of his missing dogs who's been very badly hurt, but who is still alive and who is whimpering. And so Vladimir, he's so happy that one of his dogs is okay, and he grabs his dog. But unfortunately for Vladimir, this was a trap. Now, we don't know this for sure, but the leading theory is this Siberian tiger actually set this trap on purpose to catch Vladimir. It's believed that this tiger wounded the dog so the dog would begin to whimper, luring Vladimir out, at which point the tiger could pounce. 4 days later, that armed search party led by Yuri arrived at Vladimir's cabin. They found it destroyed with blood everywhere. They went inside. There was nothing there. They came back outside. And that's when Yuri's dog began running in circles, and the crows flew into the air, and they heard that deafening roar like the whole forest was roaring. Well, that was the sound of the Siberian tiger. Luckily, though, Yuri was not just some rugged outdoorsman. He was actually a member of something called the Inspection Tiger Unit, which basically is like a SWAT team that responds to tiger attacks. And so when Yuri heard this unbelievable roar, he just started walking straight towards it. But with every step Yuri and his team took into the forest, the roars coming from this tiger faded farther and farther away from them. But at the same time, Yuri began to notice on the ground little scraps of clothing. And so Yuri and his team, instead of trying to follow this roar, they just began following these bits of clothing. And these scraps eventually led them to a big clearing in the forest. And in this clearing were these two big red circles in the snow. And so Yuri and his men carefully approached these circles. And when they realized what was in them, they just stood there in silence. In the center of the left circle was a heap of Vladimir's clothing, and then underneath them were just bits and pieces of Vladimir, like he was ripped apart into different pieces and kind of piled up in this circle. And in the other circle, the right circle, was Vladimir's head, and it had been completely skinned. And after seeing this, Yuri and many other people have come to the conclusion that this Siberian tiger attacked Vladimir just for revenge. That this tiger felt like, Vladimir was encroaching on its territory, it stole its boar kill, and then also Vladimir had shot the tiger, wounding it, which only incited the tiger more. And so finally the tiger laid a trap and caught Vladimir and ripped him to pieces and then displayed him for the search party to find. Yuri and his team would eventually find and kill this Siberian tiger. But by this point, the tiger had actually managed to kill at least one other hunter, and very much in the same way it killed Vladimir, by luring this hunter into a trap, and then pouncing and killing, and ripping the hunter to pieces, and then displaying them, basically warning other hunters not to come in here. And while the death of this tiger certainly made Yuri and other people living in this area feel more safe, at the same time, Yuri has been told by other locals that unfortunately now, because of his brush with this tiger, he has been marked by the tiger, just like Vladimir. And so, according to legend, at some point, unless Yuri goes far, far away, he's going to be tracked down and killed by a tiger. Just a reminder, my very first book, MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. You can find it wherever books or audiobooks are sold. This book is truly a brand new experience for anybody who's a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. We've never had a book before, so this is a big deal. It's a collection of 9 stories. Some are new, some are old, but they're all awesome. The artwork is incredible. The storytelling is just superb. So if you have not purchased your copy yet, or you haven't bought it for one of your friends yet, come on, go to book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books are sold and get a copy today. Again, that is book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books or audiobooks are sold to get your copy of our first book today. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, that are available to listen to right now. But many of them on this podcast are only available on the podcast. They are not on YouTube. Again, that podcast is called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's hairspray with Gorilla Glue adhesive spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On February 24th, 2019, a woman arrived at a ceramics factory in Hubei province in China. She walked through the front door into the main office where she saw a desk attendant. She informed them she was a quality control inspector and she was there that day to inspect their vehicles. The attendant was accustomed to their company being periodically inspected, and so she asked the woman if she needed any help, and the woman said, "Nope, I'm just going to roam around your building, check what I need to check, and then I'll be out of here." And so the attendant told her that was totally fine, and if she needed anything, just come back and she would help her. And so the inspector thanked her and then turned around and went out the front door and checked the vehicles in the front lot of the ceramics factory. And then after she was done, she went back into the main office. She walked past the attendant and out the back door into the very active yard where all day long these huge bulldozers would move around thousands of pounds of sand. And so the inspector walked out that back door and she scanned the yard and she saw there were 2 bulldozers doing just that, moving all around. And then off to the left side, there was a dump truck that seemed to be stationary. And so very confidently, she just walked right into the yard and made her way over to that dump truck. And then when she got there, she flagged the driver down and said she was an inspector and that she was going to check the vehicle out. And so the driver helped her by turning on and off signals and moving back and forth. And then at some point, the inspector needed the dump truck driver to back up a significant distance. She needed to watch him do that. And so she, the inspector, backed away from the dump truck until she was in the middle of the yard, standing right in front of this parked bulldozer. What happens next is all caught on video. And so as she's standing there and she's watching the dump truck back up right in front of her, the bulldozer driver right behind her turns on the machine and immediately lurches forward. Now, the driver of this bulldozer did not see the woman, and she was in his blind spot right in front of the bucket of his bulldozer. And he was not aware there was somebody on foot walking around the yard. It's an extremely dangerous place to be on foot. And so he goes right into her and he knocks her backwards. She falls into the bucket. She starts screaming, but no one can hear her. It's so loud. And the driver drives the bucket directly into a pile of sand and scoops up thousands of pounds of sand that come down directly on this woman. So now she's completely buried alive and being crushed by all this sand. And then the driver, completely oblivious, lifts the bucket up, turns around and drives across the yard and dumps the sand and the woman into a vibrating sand crusher. The vibrating sand crusher is exactly what it sounds like. It pulverizes bits of rock and stone and grinds them down into a very fine powder. The machines come in various shapes and sizes, but this one inside of this ceramics factory was a top-loaded version, and it basically looked like a big dumpster with this big opening at the top. And so these bulldozer drivers would take these clumps of sand and they would dump it in this opening at the top of this bin. And then once they dumped their sand into the opening, the machine would vibrate, causing the sand to filter its way down towards the bottom of the machine, where there were these big, vicious metal claws that constantly smashed together and would just completely obliterate anything that passed through them. In the video, when the driver dumps his bucket load into the sand crusher, you can actually see the woman falling in, but then she immediately jumps into action and begins trying to pull herself up and out of this pile. And at some point, she gets most of her upper body out, and she waves, and she gets the attention of the driver who's just dumped her into the sand crusher. And the driver, he stops right away. You can see the vehicle lurch to a stop. He leaps out and he starts running running over to the sand crusher, but as he's running over, this woman who's waving and waving, at some point her leg or some other part of her gets grabbed by those jaws at the bottom of the machine, and she's pulled slowly down into the sand crusher and disappears under the sand. When this happens, the driver is frantic and he's screaming for other people in the factory to come over and help, and at some point the others inside, they realize there's an emergency and they all run over, but when they realize what's happened, that someone has fallen into the sand crusher, they all just stop and stand there because they know there's nothing they can do. The woman was gone. In June of 2015, 45-year-old James Young landed his dream job. For the last several years, James had been a 5th grade teacher in East Canton, Ohio, teaching special education. And while he loved his job and he loved the kids he worked with, he had always had his eye on becoming a guidance counselor for high school students. In 1988, James had actually graduated from East Canton, Ohio High School, and ever since his graduation, he had wanted to come back to the school and help the next generation of East Canton students prepare for their lives as adults. And a guidance counselor was designed to do just that. James had applied for the job before, but every time he applied, they would tell him that while he was qualified, there just wasn't a spot open for him. However, at the end of that school year, he was told a guidance counselor spot had opened up at the high school and the job was his if he wanted it. And so, of course, James said, yes, I'll take the job. And immediately he told his mother about this amazing news. And his mother, who lived only a block away from him in East Canton, Ohio, would say that her son was so ecstatic about the job that normally when summer break was coming up, he would really look forward to that time off from school. But now that he had this new job to look forward to, he was already anxious for the summer to be over. James was a single man, but he was not lonely. He had a number of very close, lifelong friends that he would spend virtually all of his off time with. And that summer, he did just that. He went out with his friends, they explored all of Ohio and outside surrounding areas, they spent a lot of time outside, and they enjoyed each other's company. Towards the end of the summer, James and his friends knew it was time to schedule their annual trip to Cedar Point. Cedar Point is an amusement park about 2 hours northwest of East Canton, Ohio. It's situated right on the shores of Lake Erie, and it's known for its incredible roller coasters, of which they had 17, making them the park with the second most roller coasters in the world. Every summer, since James could remember, he and his very close friends would make a trip out to Cedar Point, usually at the end of the summer, to kind of cap off their vacation. After looking at their calendar, they decided that the best day to go would be Thursday, August 13th. This would give the group of friends one more fun thing to do before the following week James started his new job. So on the morning of that Thursday, the friends piled into a car and they made the 2-hour commute up to Cedar Point. And as soon as they got there, they went inside, they grabbed a map, and they began systematically hitting as many rides as they possibly could. And so by 4:30 p.m., they were totally exhausted. They'd been on virtually every ride. And so they were about to call it a day when James and his friends decide, hey, let's go on one more ride before we pack it in. And so they pull out their map and they're looking, and they realize they haven't gone on one of their favorite rides. It was called the Raptor. The Raptor was not Cedar Point's biggest roller coaster, but it was their fastest. It would reach a top speed of 57 miles per hour. Passengers are seated 4 across with their feet dangling below them in these suspended chairs with the big harness that comes down. And then once the ride starts, they're brought slowly up this 137-foot hill. And then at the top, they pause before being dropped down into this nearly 4,000-foot long track that spins them upside down 6 different times. So James and his friends, they closed up their map and they ran their way over to the Raptor. They got in line, and by 4:50 p.m., they had made it to the front of the line. They got into their seats, their harness came down, and then the ride started. And they were pulled up to the top of the hill, they paused, and then they were launched down the track. And for 2 minutes, they zipped and zagged and looped-de-looped all through this track. And then it was just suddenly over. And the friends had a great time on the ride. Except James realized about halfway through the ride, when they were upside down, his phone and wallet had come out of his pockets, and he actually saw them fall down towards the ground. And although he didn't see exactly where they landed, he had a pretty good idea of where they were. And so after they got off the ride, the friends were kind of talking about how much fun it was. And James said to them, hey, I lost my cell phone and wallet. Will you guys come with me while I go look for them? And so the friends agreed. They left the Raptor station and they walked down the paved path until they were in front of this fence that said no trespassing. And so James gets up to the fence and he's looking inside of this fenced-in area, and he sees right in the middle of this restricted area is his phone and his wallet. And before James's friends could tell him not to do this, he had climbed over the fence and entered into this restricted area. He ran over to his phone and his wallet, he picked it up, and then when he stood back up again, the next wave of Raptor riders came blazing through the area, and the underside, the steel underside of the ride, hit James right in the back of the head. He never saw it coming. It threw him forward, he landed on his face, and immediately the park officials saw this happen. They stopped the ride, but the riders on board the Raptor, they didn't know what was going on, and so they're stopped on the ride. They're looking down and they hear people screaming, and they look down and they see there's this man, James, lying face down on the ground with blood pooling around his head. The fence James had climbed over was there specifically to keep visitors from getting too close to this one low point in the Raptor ride where the ride can come through and it can hit you. And so medical workers, they rush over, they hop over the fence, they get to James, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene. That day, Cedar Park was put under investigation for James's death, but after reviewing the footage and talking to witnesses, the investigation was closed and they determined that the park was not at fault. James, despite being a very intelligent and sensible man, had a brief lapse in judgment, and it unfortunately cost him his life. Today, Cedar Park is still open for business and the Raptor ride is still operational. On August 14th, 2012, Celestino Cervantes picked up 28-year-old Victor Diaz for work. Celestino was an expert roofer, and he had just hired Victor to come on his crew and help him with a particular job. This was going to be Victor's first day as a roofer, but for the past 10 years he had worked in construction, so he was familiar with the operation. The two men arrived at their job site in San Antonio, Texas around 8 a.m. that morning. They were in charge of putting a new roof on a 115-year-old building that was being redeveloped into a fancy steakhouse. Until 2001, this building had been used by a brewing company to house their enormous boilers. As such, this building was referred to as the boiler house. Protruding from the boiler house roof was this large metal duct that was 15 feet long and almost looked like a covered walkway, and it connected to the side of this huge smokestack. This duct and smokestack used to be how the built-up condensation inside the boiler house was able to travel up and out of the building. When the two roofers got out of their truck, Celestino told Victor to take his tools and make his way up to the roof of the boiler house and get to work, and that he had a few things he had to do down on the ground floor, but he would be up to check on him in a little bit. Celestino turned around and was fiddling with his equipment inside of the truck while Victor made his way into the building and out of sight. An hour and a half later, Celestino went up to the roof to check on Victor, but he couldn't find Victor anywhere and he couldn't find his tools anywhere. So Celestino went back down into the main section of this building where other contractors that were working on this renovation were, and he began asking them, hey, have you seen this guy, Victor? He works with me, I can't find him, and no one had seen him. And so Celestino's thinking to himself, well, I guess Victor must have left. But that didn't really make any sense because Victor didn't have a vehicle and he didn't live nearby. But Celestino's thinking, you know what, maybe somebody came and picked him up. Now, unfortunately, Victor did not carry a cell phone, so nobody had any way of getting directly in contact with him. So Celestino leaves the building and he calls Victor's brother and he asks him, have you seen Victor? Do you know where he might have gone? And Victor's brother says, no, I haven't seen him since this morning when he left with you. So Victor's brother began calling around to friends and family and asked them if they had seen Victor, but nobody knew where he was. So for the rest of the day, Celestino and the rest of Victor's friends and family, they went out looking for Victor at the job site and around the surrounding areas, but there was just no sign of him. And so that night, Victor's brother went to the police to file a missing person report. But the police told him that it was really too early to file a report because Victor was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, and that he should just come back in a day or two if Victor still has not shown up. 2 days go by and Victor had still not shown up, so Victor's sister-in-law went back to the police and says, okay, now I want to file a missing person report. We don't know where he is, no one can get in touch with him, we need your help. But the officer she spoke to told her that she still needed to wait another 5 days to process this request. It would turn out this was just not true. It was a mistake. There was no arbitrary waiting period to file a missing person report. So without any help from the police, Victor's friends and family and co-workers spent the next several days scouring San Antonio, scouring the job site, looking everywhere for him and handing out flyers and asking people if they'd seen him, but no one had. He had just disappeared. By Monday the following week, so 6 days after Victor has gone missing, his family had printed out dozens of these huge posters with his face on them and a number to call if you had any information about him, and their plan was to distribute them the following morning all over San Antonio. But the following morning, before they headed out, they got a call. Victor had been found. 7 days earlier, when Celestino told Victor to head inside and make his way to the roof and begin the project, Victor had gotten his tools, gone inside, he made his way up the stairwell to the second floor, and then he made a series of odd decisions. Instead of making his way to the access door and climbing his way up to the roof, he went to the far side of the second floor where there were all these wooden barriers preventing people from going any farther. He climbed over all these barriers and he reached the entrance to that huge duct where the condensation used to go. And so from his perspective, he would have been looking into this duct and it would have been completely pitch black because it connected to that smokestack and the smokestack was totally sealed off. But despite not having any idea where this tunnel goes and it clearly not being the place Celestino told him to go, Victor decides to just get into this tunnel, which required bending over because it was only 4 feet tall and 5 feet wide. So he gets inside of this tunnel and he begins shuffling his way deeper and deeper into this tunnel until he reaches the end of the tunnel where it actually connects into the smokestack. Now at the top of this duct where it connects to the smokestack, there wasn't a grate or bars or any sort of barrier that would stop you from spilling into the smokestack. And because it was totally pitch black, Victor, when he made it to the edge of that duct, he just kept on walking and fell 20 feet down to the bottom of the smokestack. And so in total darkness, Victor, who was probably badly hurt from the fall, began feeling around the inside of the chimney looking for a way out. And he eventually found a hatch that was big enough for him to fit through, but when he felt up against it, he realized it was locked from the outside and it wouldn't even budge. He couldn't even get light to come in through a crack. It was totally sealed off. And that was the only way out of the smokestack unless he could get back up to the duct, but there was no way to do that. He most likely began screaming for help, but he was encased in thick brick, and so his sound wouldn't have traveled. It would have been completely muffled. Plus, the smokestack was fairly far away from the job site, which was very noisy as it is, and so there was just no way they could have heard him. And the smokestack and the duct were not part of the renovation, and so there was absolutely no foot traffic over around the smokestack. He was completely alone, no one knew he was there, and there was no way out. 7 days after Victor fell into the smokestack, workers over at the job site, they noticed this huge swarm of flies over around the base of the smokestack. There were so many flies over there, they decided they had to go investigate. And so as they walked closer and closer to the smokestack, they were hit with this overwhelming stench of death and decay. And then when they got to the smokestack, they could see the flies were centralized on that hatch at the bottom. And so they cut the lock, they opened it up, and inside they found Victor's body. And they saw his hands were badly bloodied and bruised, and they were pressed up against the inside of the hatch, indicating in his final moments he was desperately trying to open that hatch and save himself, but there was just no way to do that. Although no one knows this for sure, it's believed Victor confused the condensation duct with the access point to the roof. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's hairspray with Gorilla Glue adhesive spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. No matter whether you believe this tragedy is the result of something paranormal or something normal and rational and explainable, no matter which way you feel, or maybe somewhere in the middle, the details of the story itself, the actual facts of the story, are horrifying. What actually happened to this poor family in the 1920s it's just one of the more terrifying ordeals that I've ever come across, and it's crazy to me that it's a true story. Without giving too much away, someone or something shows up on this farm and it doesn't leave. One of the maids starts hearing strange sounds. They start looking for this person or this thing. They start seeing things moving around in their house, and there's every indication that someone is in the farm. Someone has snuck into the farm and is terrorizing us. And then on March 31st, 1922, whatever it was, finally attacks. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the dark, strange, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then my channel is the one for you. That is literally all I do on this channel, and I upload 3 to 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, I would ask you to gently 360 no-scope the like button, subscribe, and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Back in the 1920s, there was a farmstead called Hinterkaifeck Farm that was located in southern Germany in a very rural, isolated, heavily forested area. So the occupants of the farm were the live-in maid and the Gruber family. The Gruber family was Andreas, his wife Azalea, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, Joseph and Azalea as well. And everything was going fine for the Gruber family and for their farm until the winter of 1921. When some very strange things started happening on their property. The first one to notice strange things happening around their property was their live-in maid. She spent the majority of her time in the main house, and she was alone a lot of the time. And she started to notice when she was alone that she would hear tapping, what sounded like in the walls. Not someone in another room tapping, but literally something in the walls. And she would go up and she would listen, and it would still be tapping, but she couldn't make sense of it. And then she started hearing a combination of disembodied voices and footsteps in the attic. And when she started hearing those footsteps and voices coming from the attic, she ran and told Andreas to say, hey, someone's in your attic. Andreas would go up. Even though he was skeptical, he'd go up to the attic and he would look, and not only is no one there, but it was this totally open space up there. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. There was no one up there, and there was no sign of anybody having been up there. There was no food. There was nothing. And so over the course of several weeks, the live-in maid kept saying that at night she'd be laying in bed and she would hear footsteps and voices from the attic. She'd hear tapping in the walls. She would tell Andreas, and then Andreas, he'd be frustrated with her because he didn't really believe her, and he'd go charging up into the attic and nothing would be there. And so she was just not having it. She'd been working with this family for a long time. She did not feel convinced that no one was there. She really thought this place was haunted. And so she ultimately tells the Gruber family, like, I'm sorry, but I can't stay here another night. Whenever I'm here, I feel like I'm being watched. And at night, I can't sleep because of the footsteps in the attic and these voices. I know you've checked, but I can't be here anymore. And so she quits. And it really catches the Gruber family by surprise because they rely on her help. And so they're kind of thrown for a loop because they have to replace her. And so she leaves, and now they need to go find a replacement. Over the following 6 months, they would not find a replacement, and it would create an increased workload for basically everybody on the farm, which led to a higher stress level. Everybody's kind of on edge. You know, the departure of the live-in maid was a really big deal. And so you got to put that in perspective as you hear what happens over the next 6 months. At first, after the live-in maid had left, no one reported hearing any strange sounds around the house. You know, they were so busy that they didn't even have time to consider if there was any sounds in the house that they didn't recognize. But eventually, Andreas would later admit that he started hearing the tapping sounds and the footsteps in the attic and the disembodied voices, and no one's there. And so now he's becoming paranoid, and he shared his paranoia with the rest of the family, who's now also hearing these sounds and these disembodied voices and the footsteps. And despite checking and now searching the whole property, like they've begun to actually do a full-blown investigation. Everyone's just stressed. They don't know what it's coming from. They're mad at each other for becoming paranoid. And so they just continue on with work and try to put it out of their mind that they're hearing these strange sounds. But the activity in the house would only intensify. What was initially just strange tapping sounds and what they thought were disembodied voices turned into things going missing around the house. Most notably, a set of their house keys went missing. And there's only so many people there. There's really not a good answer as to why they might go missing. And they only have a couple sets It's a big deal to lose a set of keys, and they went missing and they couldn't find them. Once the keys went missing, the family couldn't stop thinking about the strange sounds in their house and wondering if there really was someone hiding in their house. And it was terrifying. And then when young Azalea, one of the grandchildren, suddenly went missing one night, the whole family is in full panic. They go out looking everywhere for her. They're yelling in the forest. They can't find her. And then finally they find her, and she has no idea how she got out, where she went, and what even happened. She just was like, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know how I got out. She was exhausted. She was confused. They brought her back to the house, and they're trying to get her to explain why you were doing that. She can't. They go back inside, and sitting on the table is a newspaper that Andreas didn't subscribe to. No one in the family had brought. No one even in the area, it would turn out, subscribed to this particular kind of obscure newspaper. And it's just sitting in their house. A couple days after that, they noticed that someone had clearly tried to break into their tool shed, which had loads of tools in there, very expensive. There was a lock on the outside, and there was very deep gashes into the metal. It looked like someone had been, hacking away at the lock to try to break it open. But, they're living in a very isolated part of Germany where there isn't much ambient sound. And so it was strange to them that someone had been so violent with this lock, like hacking at this metal lock, presumably with something metal, and no one had heard it or reacted to it. None of the dogs had heard it, nothing. So just very confusing stuff is starting to happen around the property. But it would be what Andreas sees in the spring of 1922 that pushes he and his family over the edge from general paranoia to outright panic. So Andreas wakes up in early March of 1922. There was this huge snowstorm the night before. He gets up early and he goes to the back door of his house and he opens it up, and he can clearly see that there are footprints that have walked from the forest, which is pretty far away from his property. They have quite a bit of acreage. There's footsteps that are clearly coming out of the forest all the way up to the door that he has now just opened. And he's looking down at these footprints, and there's no return set of tracks. And so he's thinking to himself, well, whoever walked up to my house came into the house. So he shuts the door and locks it and immediately goes and wakes up his family and says, hey, why are there footprints leading up to the back door? Because there's no footprints going away. Someone came to the back door and apparently came inside. His wife, his daughter, the grandkids, no one has a clue. The maid, nobody knows. They say, hey, we've been asleep. We have no idea. So now Andreas, he's obviously thinking about the strangeness that's happened in his house over the past couple of months. And so he's worried. So he opens the door back up and he looks and he's studying these footprints and he's like, I just don't get it. You have to turn around and walk back. Otherwise you're here. You're at the house. He shuts the door and he walks around his house. He looks at all of the different exits to his house. So he looks to see if there's exiting footprints, which it's scaring him thinking about it, which means someone would have come into the house and jumped out a window or gone out another door, but he's just checking. And as soon as he makes sure there's no other footprints, he does a scan of his entire house. Because now he's convinced that someone's in his house. He goes to the attic. He goes all around. He's yelling. He's looking everywhere. There's nothing. There's no one in the house. The family's concerned, but there's no one in the house. So he keeps everything locked. And he goes outside and he starts tracking these footprints back to where they came from. And he walks all the way to the forest and they just kind of stop abruptly. Like they just started kind of magically at the edge of the tree line and walked right up to his house, but there's no clear origination besides it's just in the forest somewhere. And there's also no clear sense of what happened once they arrived at the door. So after doing one more loop around his property, he goes in the barn, he goes in the shed, he goes back in his house, he's checking the attic, he's looking everywhere, and he can't find any indication that some stranger is here. He finally decides that he's going to tell someone about what's been happening at his property. And so they did have a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was his closest neighbor, who was not really that close, but, a couple hundred yards away. And he goes over and he tells Lorenz everything. I've been hearing sounds. My maid quit because she was hearing sounds. We looked in the attic. We couldn't find anything. Then we started hearing sounds. The keys go missing. There's this newspaper in my house. My granddaughter's running out in the middle of the night. She's disappearing. She doesn't know what's going on. These footprints. I can't make sense of it. And so Lorenz, also not knowing what to make of it, suggests hey, I have extra weapons. You want to take an extra rifle and arm yourself, protect yourself? And Andreas just says, you know what? No, I'm good. I'm going to pass on the rifle. I'm probably overreacting anyways, and I'm sure we're just fine. But it would turn out he was not just fine, and he probably should have taken up Lorenz on the offer. So just a couple of days after speaking with his neighbor about the weirdness happening on his property, the Gruber family got a little bit of good news, which was they finally were able to locate another maid, a live-in maid, to come stay with them to replace the one who had left because she believed the place was haunted. And so a few weeks later, on March 31st, 1922, this new maid shows up to Hinterkaifeck. But unfortunately, this would also be the same date a horrible tragedy unfolds at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Over the course of 24 hours, someone or something was in the barn on Hinterkaifeck and was able to silently lure in members of the Gruber family one by one. Without telling anybody else what they were doing, they would walk over almost like in a trance into the barn where they would be struck in the head by something called a mattock, which is kind of like an axe. Blow to the head and they're down. As soon as they're down, whoever was in there, whatever was in there would take their bodies and move them to the corner and lay them down, kind of square them up against the corner of the barn and then cover them with hay. And then as soon as they were deceased, he would go, whatever it was, would go back and lure in the next person. So over a whole day, each of these members of the family were being lured into this barn where investigators, nobody knows what it was that was luring them in. They weren't scared when they went in. Their guard was down and they would go in and then get hit in the head with this mattock until there was 4 people stacked up in the corner. And at that point, the remaining 2 people on the farm were still in the house sleeping, and whoever was doing this went into the house and used the mattock to end their lives as well. 4 days later, on April 4th, a repairman who was scheduled to come to the Hinterkaifeck farm shows up to repair the feeding machine. He goes to the door, he knocks on the door, and it's locked. And, he can see lights on inside. He can hear the dog barking inside, but no one comes to greet him. Now, the feeder was outside of the main house, and it was actually on basically a public area of the farm. So he didn't need, them to physically get to the feeder, and he knew how to fix it. So after trying the front door, going to the back door, looking in the windows and seeing lights, hearing the dog, but everything's locked, he just said, you know what, I'm just gonna do the job. So he goes into the area where the feeder is. He does the repair, and as he's leaving, he notices that the dog that was barking, that was inside the house, is now outside the house tied up. And so he goes over to that section of the house thinking, oh, well, now I'll knock on the door. Someone's sure to see me. And again, no one comes to the door. And the back door, that clearly must have just been opened to let the dog out, is locked again. And so he's like, man, that's odd. And so instead of just leaving, he finishes the job with the feeder and he goes over to Lorenz Schlittenbauer's house, the neighbor, and he says, hey, just so you know, I was just over at the Gruber family's farm. I fixed their feeder like they wanted me to, but no one was there, but maybe somebody was there because the dog was inside, then it was outside. Don't know what's going on, but can you just let them know that I was here because I couldn't get in touch with them. But it prompts Schlittenbauer to go check on the Grubers because they haven't seen him in a couple days anyways, and so they figure they'll swing by and just make sure everything's okay. So they go over to Hinterkaifeck, and, the lights are on in the house, the dog sure enough is outside, the doors are locked, and they see that the barn is actually open. So they go over to the barn, and in the barn, at first they don't see anything, but in the back corner underneath some hay are 4 of the bodies of the Gruber family. They go inside and they find the remaining 2 bodies, and no one else is there. Although there was signs of someone recently eating in the kitchen. The fire was lit, it was like the house was being lived in at that very moment. Although to Schlittenbauer and anybody that was there, they have no way of knowing that it's been days since the Gruber family had passed away. And so they end up leaving and getting in touch with authorities. So the police show up and they're able to determine with relative certainty that the tragedy took place on March 31st. But for 4 days afterwards, someone lived in the Gruber house, slept in their beds, ate their food, lit fires, lounged around inside. They played with the dog. They milked the cows. I mean, they lived in this house. They ran the farm for 4 days. And other neighbors would even say that, yeah, we saw smoke coming out of the chimney on, April 3rd and April 2nd. And so it was confirmed that someone had been staying in this house, which is so creepy. And so the police are a little bit baffled, and they're like, okay, well, then it was probably a drifter. Target of opportunity. They probably saw this isolated farm, and they probably were going to rob them, stay there a little bit, and then leave. But when they searched the farmhouse, there were large sums of cash that were just out practically in the open, like barely hidden, that had not been taken. And anybody that was robbing the place would have taken the cash. And so probably wasn't a robbery, which leaves maybe a crime of passion. But they were like, what's the motive? And unfortunately, Andreas was not particularly well liked in the town that was nearby. And so there was lots of people that didn't like Andreas, which made it really hard to whittle it down. So they started just interviewing like crazy. They're talking to hundreds of people that were in connection with, that could be connected to this, but they're getting nowhere. They did feel like Lorenz Schlittenbauer was probably the best suspect, because he's right there, he's right next door, he's their neighbor. And in fact, he had wanted to marry Victoria, the daughter, and Andreas had told him outright no, and they thought that could be a reason. But like the big issue with Lorenz Schlittenbauer being the primary suspect is, he had a farm to keep and a family to take care of. And so how could he have committed this crime and then ran the Hinterkaifeck farm for 4 days and lived there and slept there without his family knowing? And his family's like, no, he's been here with us. And so the police, they aren't able to solve it. They don't really have any decent suspects. And so they kind of leave it with, well, whoever did this probably had been there for about 6 months, potentially, before they committed the crime, and then stayed there for a few days afterwards and then vanished. And to this day, they have not been caught. And they even reopened this case in 2007. But they found that, despite the number of suspects and despite the evidence available, it just wasn't enough to provide any sort of clarity on what actually happened. So it remains a huge mystery. So like any other high-profile unsolved mystery, there are literally hundreds of potential explanations for what could have happened. But what I'm most interested in is what you all think could have happened. I will do my best to look through your comments, and I'll respond to the ones that are the most interesting or the most plausible. So please, if you would, in the comment section, let me know what you think happened at Hinterkaifeck. And if you haven't already, please gently 360 no scope the like button, and then please also subscribe and turn on all notifications so you get more content just like this in the days to follow. That's gonna do it, guys. I hope this was interesting. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out to me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. And I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there as well. And that's gonna do it, guys, and I will talk to you soon. One night in August of 1986, villagers in a tiny rural town in West Africa heard a loud booming sound coming from outside. Most of the villagers thought this sound was thunder, others had no idea what it was, but the noise seemed insignificant. Little did they know, that sound was actually a death sentence. They just didn't know it yet. This story sounds like it was pulled straight out of an apocalypse movie, except it really happened. And the scary part is, it could happen again today. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a s'more, but instead of chocolate, use mud. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Before sunrise on August 22nd, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He didn't know why, but he knew, something happened last night. I gotta remember it. But as he lay there kind of jogging his memory, he felt like there were holes in his memory, like he couldn't quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered about the night before, and that was at some point he had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And Ephraim, kind of somewhere in the back of his mind, had thought, oh, it's going to rain tonight, and maybe when I wake up it'll still be raining. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound and then getting in his bed the night before. But at some point he remembered being in his bed and feeling kind of sick. And that was it. That was his whole memory of the night before. And so that morning, August 22nd, when Ephraim has suddenly woken up feeling confused, he rolled over and he looked out the window right nearby his bed, and he looked outside and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained anytime recently. And so Ephraim is thinking to himself, something is definitely off here, but I just can't get my mind right. And so finally, Ephraim just sits up in his bed, he swings his legs out of his bed onto the ground, he stands up and practically falls over once he's on his feet. But he eventually gets himself back up, kind of steadies himself, and then he thinks, okay, I need to go check on my 4 kids and make sure they're okay. But the second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body didn't obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nios, and Nios is extremely rural. There's no electricity, there's no running water, and there's no paved roads for miles. The village is actually split into 2 parts. There's Upper Nios and Lower Nios. Ephraim lived in Upper Nios, right near this big, beautiful lake called Lake Nios, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nios, which was below the lake. So that morning, after Ephraim kind of found himself standing outside of his hut for no reason, he began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nios, where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him or, what was going on generally. But as he scanned around Upper Nios, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He was it. He was the only person walking around. So, without giving it much thought, Ephraim decided he would just start walking down towards Lower Nios to try to talk to someone down there. And so he left his hut and he began walking down the hill that would take him to Lower Nios. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nios, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Normally, the baboons in the nearby forest would be barking and insects would be humming and birds would be chirping, but now it was just completely, totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying constant in Ephraim's life were gone. It was like the entire world had just shut down. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And so Ephraim whipped his head in the direction the screams were coming from, and he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he's bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he's starting to notice there's these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman. But as he was staring at them, he just couldn't quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And near them was all of their cattle, also just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. But as Ephraim stared at each of these people and each of these animals on the ground, he saw there was some blood around their noses and their mouths, and he realized no person who's sleeping would be that still. These people are all dead. These animals are all dead. And so standing there, Ephraim turned his attention from the bodies back to this woman who had dropped to her knees, and she was grabbing her father's arm and yanking on it and screaming for him to please wake up. But Ephraim could tell there was nothing she could do. Everyone was gone. And Ephraim knew somewhere deep down that, he's supposed to go over and help this woman or console her. But suddenly this wave of fear came over him, the combination of having no idea what's going on, his mind really wasn't working still, and now seeing all these dead people, it was like he just couldn't handle it. And so even though he felt terrible about this, Ephraim took one last look at this very distraught woman and her deceased family, and he turned and he ran away. And when he got back to the main trail, he continued downhill in the direction of Lower Nios. Like all of you, I spend virtually all of my time daydreaming about climbing onto the back of a wild stallion and galloping down a deserted highway into an abandoned city full of zombies that I need to fight off using my wide array of strange DIY weaponry. Well, dream no more, because today we can kill zombies for real, digitally, with Doomsday: Last Survivors. And before I show you this gem of a game, I have a surprise for you. Thanks to Doomsday, not only can you now slaughter zombies with me, but also you can win $10,000 in cash prizes. Click the link in the description below and download the game, and you could potentially win some of that money. In Doomsday, which is a zombie survival strategy mobile game, you can choose whatever shelters you want and then go out and recruit the strongest heroes, like Catherine with her amazing spinning chainsaw, and they can lead your squad and defend your base from the endless waves of zombies. Another awesome thing about this game is you can march freely and change your route at any time to attack the enemy strategically. Also, you can join an alliance to explore the world with other zombie hunters. Heck, you might even run into me and Lungy's alliance, and maybe we'll let you join. So again, Doomsday, which lets you finally kill zombies for real, digitally, is offering $10,000 in cash prizes. To potentially win some of that money, click the link in the description below and download the game, and you will see there is a might ranking, and the top 5 in that ranking will each walk away with $1,000 each. Outside of that might ranking, many other players will be chosen for cash prizes, some up to $500 each. Hurry and download Doomsday right now so you can join the limited time events to get the legendary hero Jaden and a $250 gift pack for free. The next zombie wave will arrive in 8 hours, so join me and old Lungy now. The villagers in Lower Nyos lived in these tiny huts with tin roofs that were closely grouped together, and usually, even early in the morning, Lower Nyos was a very happy and lively place with kids running around and animals walking in the road and music playing. But as Ephraim came down the hill and was within earshot of Lower Nyos, it was deadly silent. And so with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner and looked down the main road of Lower Nyos, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But when he turned the corner and looked down Main Street, all he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead so as not to look at all the dead animals, and just ran straight into Lower Nyos, and he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open and he stepped inside, and as soon as he did, he just stopped. Because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand as if she had been eating and then just fell dead. And so Ephraim, he's staring at this dead woman, and then he looks up and he realizes the bedroom is right in eyesight, and he can see her family in their beds. And at first Ephraim thought, oh, they're sleeping. But then as he continued to stare through the doorway into this room, he saw none of them were moving. Their chests were not going up and down from breathing. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those weren't animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. Yes, there were some animals, but most of them were people. He could see people slumped on top of each other, kind of piled up in doorways. He saw one person who was on his motorcycle in the middle of the road, just slumped over his handlebars. And many of the bodies were either naked or partially clothed, with piles of clothing next to them, as if they had been trying to rip their clothes off as fast as they could, like the woman up at the lake had been doing. And as Ephraim looked around in horror, he also realized that there were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. It was like they were just going about their lives when suddenly they died. And so without anything else to do, Ephraim just continued to walk in the direction he had come into the village, hoping that if he kept on going, he might run into someone who was alive. And so he begins walking down the road, he's stepping over bodies, he has no idea what to make of this, and then way down the road, up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There's a man and what looks like his son, and they're jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him. But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son, their eyes were wide and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant 1,000-yard stare. And they didn't stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they didn't even see him. They just kept on running down the road, past all the bodies. Ephraim didn't try to stop them. He just watched as they passed. And then at some point they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. And it was at this moment that another part of Ephraim's brain seemed to kind of fit into place. Because as he watched this father and son disappear, he suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind. And it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nyos villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nyos from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nyos, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other, and the villagers began to walk. And then about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder, and when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nyos. And so growing up, Ephraim, along with many other people in this village, believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nyos must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nyos, to avoid these ghosts. And so now, as this memory of hearing this story from his grandfather has come flooding back to Ephraim, he thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. And as he ran along, periodically he would stop at various tin huts and he would fling the door open in hopes he would find some survivors. But each time he went inside, everybody in there would be dead, lying in their beds or sitting in chairs or lying on the ground. But after running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own. And standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph McQuain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim. The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound that sounded like thunder to Ephraim. And then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay, but he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell, and he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim, and so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed, and when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now Joseph has opened the door, and he's looking out, and there's all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him, and Joseph just can't process anything. He's just standing there in a total daze, and Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out, and so he too just stood there looking at Joseph. And the two men just stood there right on the threshold of this hut, staring at each other, saying nothing for several minutes, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently, and then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct, but very quickly he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. But when he opened the door and went inside, he saw all of his neighbors were deceased. But Joseph, he barely reacted to this. It was like he was so numb to what was going on, he just couldn't process it. But after seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. That was his mission. And so he left his neighbor's hut, he ran back to his own hut, he climbed onto his motorcycle, and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village, but when he got there were people and they were all alive. And so Joseph tried to tell them what had happened in his village, but Joseph just had such a hard time putting his thoughts together that his sentences just didn't make sense. He was kind of incoherent. And then when he did make sense, the things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously, and so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nios to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nios, and when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nios that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nios had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22nd, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. And so on August 25th, 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. The newscasters were totally baffled about how this could have happened, and no one can figure out what killed these people. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock, and then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You gotta send me to Nios." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nios 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves, and looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim. Along with Ephraim's family, they also survived, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people. And the theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nios, in an area called Lake Manoon, 37 people suddenly dropped dead. And Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people. And after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened. And they called it unknown unnatural hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again. And in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal. But nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up. It sounded preposterous. But now, in Nios, it looked very much like their unknown, unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nios, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off. And that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unknown, unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nios is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nios. A lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short, is an odorless, invisible gas that we actually breathe out when we exhale. Now, if you inhale a little bit of CO2, that won't hurt you. If you inhale a little bit more, like a medium amount of CO2, you could feel dizzy and nauseous. Your skin will start to feel like it's on fire. You'll have rapid breathing. It'll be horrible, but you'll most likely survive if you stop breathing CO2. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you're dead. The CO2 in Lake Nios had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. Now remember, on that night, August 21st, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside, and also Joseph would recall hearing a loud booming sound that night. Now, we don't know exactly what that sound was, but it's safe to say that that noise, whatever it was connected to releasing the gas. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes, and when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. Now, we can't see the cloud, but you can imagine a big cloud, and then this toxic CO2 cloud kind of rolled its way down the hill towards Lower Nios and other villages in the area. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals, and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, like Ephraim and his family and Joseph, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nios and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Manoon. It was the unknown, unnatural hazard that Devine and Sigurdsson had tried to warn people about. The official death toll of the Lake Nios disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nios, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous and another unknown, unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a s'more, but instead of using chocolate, use mud. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload remastered versions of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Español. We post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. There is a subgenre of detective fiction that deals with locked room mysteries, which are about crimes that are seemingly impossible to commit. The standard example being a murder victim found inside of a room that was locked from the inside. Today, we're going to look at a real-life locked room mystery that took almost a decade to solve. And when the truth finally came out, nobody believed it. It literally sounded like fiction. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's Cocoa Puffs with similarly shaped dog food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On August 22nd, 1922, shots rang out from inside a stately Victorian home in Beverly Hills where Dolly and Fred Ostrich lived. Neighbors called police right away, and when officers stepped into the front door, they saw the entire house was trashed. On the floor in the living room was Fred, who had been shot to death, and next to him were 3 .25 caliber shell casings. With weapons drawn, the police cleared the entire first floor. There was no one down there. They heard screaming coming from upstairs, and so they run up the stairs, and they get up there, and no one's upstairs. And then they heard the screaming again, and they realized it was coming from inside of a closet in the master bedroom. And so as the police are clearing the second floor, they yell out to this woman and they say, "Who are you? What are you doing in the closet?" And she yells back, "I'm Dolly. I'm okay, but I'm trapped." And so after the police finish clearing the upstairs and they're sure it's safe, they go over to the closet door and they do try the handle. It's locked. They ask her, "Do you know where the key is?" And she says no. And so before they start trying to break the door down, they did a quick search of the upstairs to see if maybe they could find the key to the closet. And sure enough, across the hall in another bedroom, they found it on the ground. And so they took the key back, they opened the door up, and out came Dolly. She was okay, but obviously very frantic and panicked. And they asked her, what happened? And she told them a very abrupt and chaotic story. She said she had been hanging clothes inside of this big walk-in closet, and her back was to the door when she heard a fight break out on the first floor. And before she could even turn around to go investigate, she said the closet door was swinging shut, and then she heard it lock from the outside, and she didn't get to see who it was that shut the door. The whole thing was a bit of a head-scratcher for police, because they're thinking, okay, well, was it one person that attacked Fred downstairs and then ran upstairs and shut and locked the door immediately afterwards before Dolly could come out and see? Or was there 2 people, one person downstairs attacking and one person upstairs shutting and locking the door? Or was it more than 2 people? And despite the house being totally ransacked and there being lots of valuable stuff in their house, Dolly said the only thing she could tell was missing was the diamond-encrusted wristwatch that Fred always wore. It was not on his wrist when they discovered his body. And why, detectives wondered, were these burglars or this burglar carrying a .25 caliber weapon? Something that small was more likely to be found in a woman's purse than in a home invasion. When police spoke to neighbors, they were quick to say Fred and Dolly fought all the time, and earlier that night they had gotten into a really bad one. But as much as police wanted to point the finger at Dolly, it was just impossible for her to have committed this crime. Because how could she have murdered Fred and then ran upstairs and locked herself in the closet from the outside and then also somehow deposited that key across the hall in another room? It just didn't make any sense. But since the police had little else to go on, they dug into the new widow's past. Dolly was born in Germany in 1880, and following a move to Milwaukee, Wisconsin just before the turn of the century, she married Fred, who was 3 years older than her. Fred was driven and successful, but he was also a raging alcoholic and prone to violence. And so as Fred built up his textile empire, opening up factory after factory all across the Midwest, their marriage grew strained. He was mean and she was lonely. When they moved from Milwaukee to Southern California in 1918, their new neighbors immediately were aware of the fact that Dolly and Fred fought loudly and often, and they frequently bickered in public. Police looked high and low to see if Dolly had maybe taken a lover, but no one had ever seen her with anyone but Fred. And so while they might be miserable, they seemed to be faithful. And so try as they might, the police could find no clues that suggested anything darker or more dangerous than a petty and meaningless marriage. The case hung open, and suspicion continued to trail Dolly, even though it was physically impossible for her to have committed the crime. Now free from her unhappy marriage, Dolly moved into a new home in Los Angeles, and she took up with her estate lawyer, Herman Shapiro, who was handling her husband's $1 million estate. But just like her late husband, her new boyfriend, Shapiro, worked long hours, and he was not around much, so she was lonely all over again. So she went out and got another boyfriend, a guy by the name of Roy Klum, and she began seeing the men at the same time. A year after Fred's death, Captain Herman Klein of the Beverly Hills Police Department dropped by Dolly's estate lawyer/boyfriend's office. Detectives were still suspicious of Dolly, even though the case still made no sense. And so Captain Klein goes into Shapiro's office, and wouldn't you know it, sitting on the desk is this beautiful diamond-encrusted wristwatch that looks an awful lot like the watch Dolly claimed was the one thing stolen from her house on the night of her husband's murder. When the captain asked Shapiro how he got this watch, Shapiro told him that Dolly had given it to him as a gift, but I know where you're going with this because I thought the same thing too. I know about the missing diamond watch on the night of the murder. I asked Dolly Dolly about it when she gave it to me, and she told me that that was actually a mistake. The watch was never missing, and she later on found it tucked underneath a sofa cushion in the living room. The captain was not buying this, and so as soon as he left Shapiro's office, he immediately confronted Dolly about the watch, and Dolly said, you know what, that's right, I did find the watch, but I didn't think it was that important, so I didn't tell you guys. The captain couldn't believe what he was hearing. And shortly after, the newspapers found out about this new twist in this totally bizarre case, and they went wild with it, putting all the heat back on Dolly. Spooked by the headlines, Dolly's second boyfriend, Roy Klum, came forward to the police and said, I have a confession to make. Dolly made me hide one of her .25 caliber pistols, and I threw it in the La Brea tar pits. And then before police could even go get that gun, one of Dolly's neighbors came forward and said, yeah, I got a confession to make. Dolly asked me to get rid of a .25 caliber pistol, and I buried it in my backyard. So police went out and recovered both weapons, but they were so badly rusted, they couldn't confirm if they were in fact the murder weapons. And Dolly had an excuse. When the police confronted her with these guns, she said, oh yeah, those old things, I've had those in the house for years, but given the circumstances of my husband's death, just felt a little awkward keeping them around the house, so I had some friends get rid of them. The police were not buying this, and so in July of 1923, they arrested Dolly for killing Fred. But despite these new developments, the facts of the case had not changed. It was still physically impossible for Dolly to have committed this crime. She was locked in the closet from the outside. And so with Dolly in jail awaiting trial, investigators tirelessly hacked into her story to try to find holes in it, but they had no success. And so after every theory that might connect her to the crime was ultimately discarded, they had to drop the murder charges and Dolly was released. 7 years went by and the crime was largely forgotten about. And then in 1930, Dolly and her estate lawyer boyfriend Shapiro, they broke up. And Shapiro immediately called the police and said, you know what? I haven't been entirely truthful. I know a lot more about what happened to Fred than I've let on, and in fact, I have someone in the office with me right now that can tell you the whole story. Investigators flew to Shapiro's office, they go through the doors, and sitting inside is a man they never knew existed. His name was Otto Sandhuber. He was a quiet, small sewing machine repairman / aspiring dime store fiction writer. And the story he would tell them would be more bizarre and lurid than any investigator could have imagined. It began almost a decade before the murder. When Otto was a teenager, he had worked for Fred in one of his Milwaukee factories. One day in 1913, Dolly complained to Fred that her sewing machine was broken. And so Fred asked one of his employees, who he knew was a sewing machine repairman, the then 17-year-old Otto, if he would go over to his house and fix the sewing machine for his wife. Dolly knew her husband was going to send Otto specifically to their house, and she was very attracted to Otto. And so when Otto showed up, all she had on was a silk robe, stockings, and heavy perfume. Thus began Dolly and Otto's affair, which at first they conducted in a pretty typical way, meeting secretly in hotels, but when that became burdensome, they moved their relationship back into the ostrich home, with Otto needing to sneak in and out around Fred's schedule. But it wasn't long before nosy neighbors were asking Dolly, who's that strange man coming around your house all the time? And she would say, oh, that's my vagabond half-brother. But Dolly and Otto knew they couldn't continue in this way. But instead of breaking it off or returning to secret hotel liaisons, Dolly decided that Otto should take up residence in the ostrich home in a secret hideaway in the attic. That way no one would see him coming or going. Otto, who had no family to miss him, quit his job at the factory, moved into the secret room, and then never left. Pretty quickly, Otto and Dolly fell into a routine where when Fred would leave for work for the day, Otto would come downstairs, they'd spend time together, and then Otto would clean the house and then make bathtub gin. Before Fred came home, Otto would sneak back upstairs to write pulp stories about lust and adventure, and he would read newspapers and magazines by candlelight. Around this time, Fred started complaining to Dolly about strange noises in the house. He also started to notice they were running through food a lot faster than normal, and a couple times he thought he was short a cigar. But no matter how much Fred complained, Dolly was always able to convince him that everything he was hearing and seeing was in his head. And so over the next 5 years, they would live in 4 homes in Milwaukee, and always these strange sounds and oddities about the house would follow them, but Fred never investigated. In 1918, Fred told Dolly he wanted to move to Southern California, and so Dolly hunted down a house with an attic, a rarity in the area, and she sent Otto ahead. When Fred and Dolly arrived, Otto was already ensconced in the attic, and Fred moved in right beneath him. By the time Fred and Dolly got in their final argument on the night of August 22nd, 1922, Otto had been secretly living with them for almost a decade. On that deadly night, Otto was in his secret room listening to drunk Fred getting louder and angrier and clearly getting physical with Dolly. And so worried that he might kill his lover, Otto leapt out of the attic and ran downstairs carrying two 25 caliber pistols. He runs into the living room and he confronts Fred. And Fred is astounded to see his formerly teenage sewing machine repairman, who abruptly quit the factory so suddenly and completely, now standing in his living room. And so Fred lunged at Otto, and Otto just started shooting. It was then that Dolly hatched the scheme that had almost let them get away with it. Knowing the police would be there any minute, Dolly staged the house to look like a robbery. She told Otto to lock her inside of the closet and then ordered him to go back up into the attic. And so when the police got there, Otto was crouched silently right above their heads. After the killing, Otto moved in with Dolly in her new house, and even though they could have had a normal open relationship, Dolly ordered Otto to go live in the attic of this new house as well. It wasn't until a year later, when Dolly was briefly arrested after the police found out about the hidden guns, that Otto was forced to come out of the attic. While Dolly was sitting in jail for these gun charges, she begged her estate lawyer boyfriend, Shapiro, to go get groceries for her vagabond half-brother, Otto, who lived in her attic. She said, when you delivered them, make sure you go to the bedroom and knock on the ceiling. That will let him know it's safe to come out. But when Shapiro arrived and followed the procedure and Otto came out, Otto was so starved for human interaction and conversation that he wound up telling Shapiro the whole insane story. But instead of going to police, Shapiro told Otto that he should just leave. And he did. He went and became a janitor and he got married. The secret held until Dolly and Shapiro broke up for good, at which point Shapiro called the police. Dolly and Otto were arrested and the press went insane. They called this the Batman case because Otto was living like a bat in a cave. This was before Batman the comic was a thing. Otto was convicted of manslaughter, but the statute of limitations was up, so he was allowed to walk free. As for Dolly, she was allowed to walk free too because the jury hung on her conspiracy to commit murder charges. After the trial, Otto disappeared and nothing more is known about him. As for Dolly, she stayed in LA and she died in 1961 at the age of 80, 2 weeks after marrying yet again. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's Cocoa Puffs with similarly shaped dog food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. A couple days ago, I was researching topics for this channel and I found this amazing true crime case from the 1980s. And I began researching it, and the first thing that pops up is HBO Max has just released a 6-part docudrama called The Murder at the White House Farms, and it's covering this case. And so I'm like, oh great, I'll watch the first 10 minutes of the first episode. It'll give me a good mental picture for this story when I cover it on my channel. And I hit play on the first episode and literally stayed up all night binge watching all 6 episodes. It's so good. The show is so good. I already knew it was going to happen, and I loved it. The acting is incredible. They have 3 actors from the Game of Thrones that are lead characters in the show, and that's a big deal. Game of Thrones is pretty epic too. The next morning, I opened my emails, and sitting in my inbox is a message from HBO Max saying, hey, we'd love it if you could help us promote our new show, The Murder at the White House Farms. And I thought that was so funny. I'm like, that's a sign. So I'd like to give a huge thanks to HBO Max for sponsoring today's video. The link to their brand new 6-part docudrama called The Murders at the White House Farms is in my description below, but be careful. If you click on it, it is a very addicting show. And if you're still on the fence about it and you're like, I don't know if I want to watch this or not, well, the first story I'm covering today on my top 3 list is The Murders at the White House Farm. But before we get started, please invite the like button over to your house for a sleepover, and then while they're sleeping, buzz a square of hair off their head. All right, let's get into today's stories. At 3:26 a.m. on August 7th, 1985, a very distraught man called the police and he said, "I think my father is in mortal danger. He lives down the road from me. I was just on the phone with him and it seems like something is totally wrong. Can you please go check on him?" The police tell him to calm down and explain really what's going on here, what happened on the phone. And so the man, whose name was Jeremy, said his dad called him and he was talking about his daughter, so Jeremy's sister, and her name was Sheila. And he's like, "Sheila's gone crazy. She's gone berserk and I think she has a gun." And Jeremy's telling police that he didn't know what his dad was talking about and he's trying to get more information from his dad. He's like, "What do you mean she's got a gun? What's going on over there?" But at some point in this phone call with his father, the phone line just cuts out. And Jeremy's left with all these questions that have gone unanswered. He tried calling back, but it didn't go through, and that's when he called the police. The police asked Jeremy if he had heard any shots fired in the background before the phone cut out. And Jeremy says, "No, but my sister is schizophrenic, she's got a bad temper, and she had been fighting with my parents all week, in particular with my dad. And right before the phone cut out, my dad sounded really scared, like something bad was about to happen or was happening. And so we need to get over there right now." And so the police say, "Okay, we're going to check it out right now." So they hang up with Jeremy and the police head down the road towards White House Farms, where Jeremy's father lives. They park a little ways away from the house itself, safely behind a wall and some trees, because they don't want to go too close in case Sheila really does have a gun and starts shooting at them. As the police are getting out of their vehicle, another car comes driving down the road from the same direction the police had come from. The police tell them to stop and the person gets out and it turns out it's Jeremy. He didn't live that far away and he comes running over and he's like, "We got to go in there. You have to go in there right now." And the police are like, "We're not going to do that. You stay with your car." Before the police were prepared to go into this house, they wanted to scope it out and get a sense of what was going on because they really didn't know anything about the house besides what Jeremy told them. So a small group of police officers goes behind this other building that's kind of adjacent to the White House Farms, but pretty close to the actual farmhouse. And they go around the backside and they peek around the corner and they start looking at the house. And it's still dark outside. And there's a couple of lights on inside the house and there's no movement, there's no sound, and they're just staring at it. And then one of the officers notices movement, or what he thinks is movement, up in the second floor. And the group of them back up behind the building. They didn't want to be seen. They were worried if Sheila saw them, it would trigger her to harm the other people in the house or harm herself. So they back up away from this building, making sure to stay out of sight of that second floor window and really out of sight of any of the windows on this farmhouse. And they go back to the intersection where the police cars are and where Jeremy is, and they decide they're going to take the diplomatic approach. And so they call in a negotiator who, with a bullhorn, goes up behind that little building and they start calling out to Sheila, trying to get her to peacefully put her weapon down and come outside. But there's no sound in the house, there's no more movement in the house as far as anyone can tell. And this turns into a multi-hour long standoff where no one comes out of the house, no one goes into the house, and then the sun comes up and the police are starting to get frustrated. And so they eventually call the negotiator back and they say, "Okay, we're going to need to make entry." A small group of police assaulters began making their way up towards the farmhouse. They get up to the door, it's locked. They try the other door, it's locked. All the windows are locked. And so they bring up a sledgehammer, smashed on the front door, and they make entry into this hallway. They immediately make a right and they're getting ready to confront Sheila wherever she is, but they don't see her. They go all the way down this hallway and it opens up into the kitchen. And hunched over the stove is a man who's clearly deceased, who winds up being Jeremy's father. He had been shot to death and he's laying in the kitchen. So they find him, they scan the rest of the kitchen and they look all around the first floor and there's no one else down there. And this whole time they're not hearing any other noises in the house. It's totally silent. They make their way upstairs and as soon as they get to the top of the stairs, they go right into the first room on the right, and laying on the bed is a deceased older woman who's also been shot to death, and that would wind up being Jeremy's mother. Laying on the ground next to the bed was a woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, who would wind up being Jeremy's sister, so Sheila, the one who had gone berserk apparently according to the father. She's laying on the ground and she has a rifle that's over her chest and the barrel is pointed up towards her head, and she has a gunshot wound that's going in underneath her chin, and so she's deceased as well. The police leave that room, they go across the hall into another bedroom, and when they go inside they find two more bodies that are both laying in their beds. They were 6-year-old twins. They were Sheila's sons. They had both been shot to death as well. After that, there was nobody else in the house, so all of the family has been wiped out. Very quickly, this case was labeled a clear-cut murder-suicide perpetrated by Sheila. She had a history of mental illness, she had apparently gone berserk that night, and she had a gun. Everything fit. And so the police were ready to just write this off as a murder-suicide, especially with the amount of media attention this case got. There was a lot of pressure to just solve this case and move on. And so murder-suicide became the answer, and they were not looking for any other answer. But there was one detective that was not willing to accept that this was clearly a murder-suicide, and he had a couple reasons for it. The first thing he noticed, because he was there when the bodies were discovered, was Sheila was carrying a rifle that had a 10-round magazine, and Sheila did not have any pockets on the clothes she had on when they found her. That's important because she fired 25 shots. So that required 2 reloads, except the ammunition to this gun was downstairs, and a lot of the shooting happened upstairs. So after her first volley of fire on the second floor, where presumably you have at least a couple people that are still totally alive, she had to walk downstairs, reload the gun, come back upstairs, do her second volley of fire, go back downstairs, reload that second time, and then she finishes her course of fire. And it made him wonder, why didn't anybody try to stop her while she was doing the reload? Because it required going all the way down, getting the rounds, jamming them into the magazine, putting it into the gun, and then going back upstairs. That's a lot of time that other people could have potentially tried to stop her, or at a minimum, just tried to escape. But it was like everybody just laid in bed. It was like they didn't know what was happening despite so many rounds being fired very close to them. Stan also found out Sheila did not have extensive weapons training, and so she wouldn't be natural at reloading a weapon. And so for her to go down and reload twice and not chip any of her nails, she had long painted nails, that seemed like a bit of a stretch, because that requires pretty coordinated movements. And for her to never have done that before and just to be able to easily reload, that seems like a stretch too. Stan also figured out there was a window that had a faulty latch on it, that if you pulled lightly on it, it would stay locked. But if you pulled hard and kind of jostled it around, it could open and it could shut, which means the house was not secure when they got there, even though they thought it was. And that was a big part of their whole, this is a murder-suicide, because Sheila locked all the doors and windows before she committed this crime. But if any of those doors or windows were open, it kind of leaves open the opportunity for someone else to have gotten in there and gotten out before the police. But the biggest discovery by far that puts all the others to shame is something Stan found under the stairs inside the house. And everything before that, all the evidence that Stan was presenting to the other officers saying, hey, we should take a look at this. I don't know if this is a murder-suicide. I think there might be potential for somebody else to be responsible. Well, no one was taking him seriously until he came to the table with what he found underneath the stairs. Everybody had to stop what they were doing and say, okay, yeah, we need to look closer at this. And so if you want to learn more about that, go ahead and click on the link inside of the description. It will bring you to the landing page where you can watch this series that I've been raving about. It's on HBO Max and it's called The Murders at the White House Farm. And it does a great job of showcasing this huge find and then the follow-on plot twist. On the morning of November 13th, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were asleep in their home in Amityville, New York. The 7th member of the family, Ron, was sitting on his bed in the basement. At around 1 a.m., he gets up off his bed, he grabs a rifle, and he starts walking up the stairs. He goes across the first floor, goes up the second floor stairs, and he gets to the second floor landing, and he walks right into his parents' bedroom, which was totally dark besides this little candle that had been lit next to his father's bedside, and he raises his rifle and he puts 2 rounds into his father's back. And then as soon as his father is still, he aims at his mother and he shoots her 2 times. And then he puts the gun down and he walks out and he goes across the hall into his brother's room. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot into his 12-year-old brother, Mark, and then he aims at his 9-year-old brother, John, and he fires 1 shot into him as well. Then he leaves their bedroom and he walks down the hall to another bedroom where he finds his 13-year-old sister, Allison. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot. He leaves her room, he goes up the 3rd set of stairs up onto the 3rd floor, he finds his 18-year-old sister Dawn, and he fires 1 shot into her, and then he was done. Altogether, it took Ron about 15 minutes to massacre his family. At no point was he panicked or running around or acting crazy. He was just walking calmly room to room, taking very well-aimed shots. to ensure they didn't get up again. He put the rifle down and he went outside and he jogged to a bar where he went inside and he put on this big facade that he had just found his family and they were hurt and could you come help him? And when they got to the house, he refused to go inside, but the people from the bar went inside and they discovered this horrible scene. And when the police show up, Ron goes over to them and he actually confesses and says, "I killed my family." Even though the DeFeo family had a reputation for being very dysfunctional, it was Ron who had the worst reputation. He was known around Amityville for heavy drug use, for being a total alcoholic, and for getting really aggressive and confrontational with people. He was just a guy no one wanted to be around. And so when news got out in Amityville that this horrible thing has happened, and it looks like Ron is the one who did it, no one was really that shocked. But when details of the crime scene, specifically the way the bodies were positioned, made people wonder, is there more to this case that we don't know about? All of the DeFeo family members had been found lying face down in their beds, and none of them showed any signs of putting up a struggle against their attacker, which led investigators initially to think that they must have been sedated, that Ron must have drugged them somehow before he carried out this attack. But when the toxicology reports came back, no one in the family had any substance in their system. At first, the police did not think that was a very big deal. They figured, you know what? The family just must not have heard the different gunshots. He wasn't shooting lots of rounds. It was, one single round here, one single round here, that perhaps they just didn't hear it, and that's why no one tried to escape. But it turns out the rifle Ron was using, the .35 caliber Marlin, is one of the loudest rifles you can own. And in fact, investigators went out and did a test with it, and they fired it indoors, and you could easily hear it a mile away. And so investigators said, well, then it looks like they must have heard these gunshots, but for some reason, didn't get out of their beds. They didn't try to fight back in any way. They just kind of took it. And then you have the weirdness of Ron's confession. On the night of the attack, when Ron is sitting on his bed and he can't sleep and everybody else is asleep upstairs, he starts hearing a voice in his head that's saying, "Catch them, kill them." And he thinks he's just losing his mind. But then out of the shadows, straight across from him, from underneath the steps in the basement, this shadowy figure emerges and starts walking towards him, and he can see what looks like its mouth moving and saying the words, "Catch them, kill them." And Ron's looking up at it as this figure walks all the way up to him and bends down and gets right next to his ear. And he says right into his ear, "Catch them, kill them." And then Ron said involuntarily he reached over to the rifle that was on the bed with him, and he stood up and he began walking towards the steps. And he knew what was going to happen. He was going to go kill his family, and he didn't want to do it. But he felt like he didn't have any more control over his body, and that's when he realized he was being possessed by this demon in the basement. While Ron's confession terrified everybody in Amityville, the idea that there was a demon living in the basement of this house that possessed someone to go kill their family, that terrified everybody. But it didn't hold up in court, and ultimately Ron was sent to jail for life. 1 year after the attacks, another family, the Lutz family, moved into the house in Amityville. But they left 28 days later because they were hearing voices coming from the basement. After hearing about the mass murder that occurred in the house, and now the Lutz family saying that there's something in the basement, world-renowned demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, they descend on the property, and very quickly Ed and Lorraine say, yes, this house is definitely haunted. And in fact, to this day, the Amityville house is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. But while Ed and Lorraine were there, they took a very famous picture. Lorraine was walking around the second floor near where the brothers' room was, and she was snapping pictures, and the only people in the house at the time these pictures were being taken were her and her husband, Ed. And here is the picture that she took on the second floor. She claims this boy standing on the left side of the picture is the ghost of John DeFeo. Today, the house still stands, and it's been bought and sold a number of times over the years because apparently no one likes to live in this house for a very long time. On June 10th, 1912, the Moore family was sleeping peacefully in their beds on their quiet street in Villisca, Iowa. Joe and Sarah Moore, the mother and the father, were asleep upstairs in their room, and their 4 children were down the hall in another room. In addition to the Moore family sleeping upstairs, there was also 2 more children sleeping on the first floor in the guest room. It was the Stillinger sisters, and they were over for a sleepover. And unbeknownst to all the sleeping people in the house, there was a strange man who had broken into the house while they were at church, gone into the attic, and was hiding in there, smoking cigarettes and carrying an axe. Shortly after midnight, this stranger believed the coast was clear, and they silently opened up the small door and they crouched down and walked out of the attic into the second floor hallway, wielding this axe in their left hand. They began walking down the hallway. They passed the children's room on their right, and they made their way down to the end of the hall where the master bedroom was. They walked inside the room and stood right next to Joe, and then violently raised the axe over their head, so quickly and so high that it actually struck the ceiling, and then brought it down blade first directly onto Joe's face, over and over and over again until Joe did not resemble a human being. While this was happening right next to her, Sarah's beginning to stir and look around what's going on. Meanwhile, the killer has now moved to the other side of the bed and is standing over Sarah and using the backside of the axe. So not the blade part, but the backside of the axe head. He raises it up and then brings it down on her head and repeatedly hits her over and over and over again until she too is indistinguishable and does not look like herself or even human. The killer is very calm. He takes the sheets and pulls them up over the faces of both of the people he just killed. And then he goes back out into the hall and he walks down and he goes into the children's room. One by one, he raises the axe and drops the axe on each of the children's heads. And then after they are deceased, he pulls the sheets up over their head. The killer leaves the room and goes downstairs to where the Stillinger sisters are, and then just like everybody else in the house, he raises the axe and drops it over and over and over again on the heads of each of these girls until they're no longer living as well. Afterwards, he raises the sheets over their faces, and now everyone in the house is deceased and has their face covered. At this point, the killer goes back upstairs and goes back into the master bedroom, and he stands in front of Joe and Sarah's bed, and after a little while, he begins striking them dozens more times, even though both of them were clearly deceased at this point. At this point, the killer shifted gears and began focusing on covering his tracks, cleaning up. And he began taking clothes out of closets and pulling whatever sheets he hadn't used. He began tacking these things up onto all of the windows and any spaces on the doors so that nobody could see in. He also began covering up the mirrors, which no one understood why he did that. After the house is totally covered up, the killer goes into the kitchen and he cooks himself a meal, but he doesn't eat the food. He cleaned off the axe and placed it up against the wall on the first floor. He then took a huge bowl, filled it up with water, and then washed his bloody hands and began to clean himself a little bit, and then he left the bloody water just sitting on the counter. And then, strangely, he took a huge slab of bacon from in the kitchen and he put it in the middle of the floor, and then next to it was a keychain. And some people think this might have to do with some ritual he was performing, but to this day, no one really knows why he did that. And then he took some keys from inside the house, walked out the door, turned around, locked it behind him, and disappeared. The Moore household normally was a very rambunctious place with all these kids running around, and the neighbors were very close. And so the next morning, when the neighbors did not see the Moore family coming outside to do their chores around 7 a.m., they were concerned and they went over and they knocked on the door. There was no answer. They noticed everything had sheets over it, so they couldn't see inside. And so Joe's brother was hailed to the house and he brought along a key, and he opened up the door and he walked inside and he immediately saw the Stillinger sisters and what had been done to them. And he got incredibly sick and he ran outside and they called police. Police come down and they find this horrible scene. Even though they have the murder weapon, they have the victims, their bodies are right here, there's blood, there's all sorts of stuff and things that the killer must have manipulated. And you would think there's enough here that you'd be able to refine your search to a couple different suspects and eventually figure out who did this, but they weren't able to. And to this day, we have no idea who did this. The house itself where the attack happened has not been updated since the attack. Somebody bought the property and then maintained it so it could be a tourist attraction. And so to this day, you can go to the Veylora axe murder house and you can stay there. You can sleep there overnight and you can actually tour the area, and it looks the same way it did when the murders happened. Many people believe that house is haunted. And in fact, in 2014, someone who was there staying overnight as a tourist inexplicably stabbed themselves and had to go to the hospital, and they don't even know why they did it. And so that's kind of added to the legend of the Veylora axe murder house, that the house itself will cause you to harm yourself. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you found the secret in today's video, please tell us in the comments what it is and where you found it. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button over to your house, and while they're sleeping, buzz a small square of their hair off. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. Remember to click the link in my description to go watch the Murders at the White House Farm. It's an awesome show. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.